Welcome to our session on public procurement and relationalism. Public procurement never has such a boring phrase been applied to something so important to both government and to our well-being. So in this session, we're going to consider the practices of the professionals whose job it is to spend about $13 trillion annually around the world. My own view is that this group of professionals create more of a channel than a challenge to public procurement or to relationalism. If we think about relationalism as the sort of engaging with the market or solving problems on a contract, then I think the professionals that are well trained include public procurement professionals. But that's enough for me. We have an amazing panel here. We are in the round, which has been interesting for our AV folks who at the last minute accommodated. So if there's any difficulty hearing or seeing us, that I apologize for that. But the reason we're doing this is to really have a round table and to try and include as many people as possible in this conversation. So we will be going around the room a few times, starting now with introductions. Ben. I think.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ben Brunges, and I'm an associate professor at the Evans School of Public Policy and Governance at the University of Washington. I study government contractor performance, primarily analyzing federal government data. I'm also, in recent years, interested in contracts as mechanisms for social change, so how we use contracts to achieve our social objectives. I'm excited to be here with you all today.
Hello everyone, my name is Carol. I hold a joint Italian and French PhD on sustainable public procurement, and I'm an attorney at law admitted to the Italian bar. Since 2013, I've been working for different international organizations, for example, the World Trade Organizations, where I came up with the idea that I'm going to present today. Currently, I'm working for the Lebanese Public Procurement Authority within a project funded by the European Union and executed by the French Agency for Development.
Hi everyone, I'm Kate Goff. I'm a partner at Freshfields, which is a global law firm, and I'm head of our public procurement practice. So I focus day to day on delivering public contracts, but also on legal challenges to the award of contracts. So we'll speak from that perspective.
Hi, I'm Carolyn Heinrich. I'm a professor of public policy, education, economics, political science, and health policy at Vanderbilt University, and I've been studying contracts for about 30 years and present some research co-authored with at least one other colleague who's in the room here today.
Thank you for the invitation, Rory. I'm Jane Lynch. I'm a professor in procurement for Cardiff University. I lead the Centre of Public Value Procurement, and I'm proud to support Welsh Government with design and implementation of policy. But I also co-lead a research group, the International Research Study on Public Procurement.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm Michal Plaček. I'm full professor of Public and Social Policy at Charles University, Czech Republic. My research focuses on green public procurement, corruption, and cross-sector partnership. And I also served for 12 years as Chief Audit Officer for local government. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. I'm a practitioner. My name is Sayama Jaffa. I started my career on the supplier side, delivering government contracts as part of the voluntary charity sector. Heroically delivering government contracts, I should say. And I now work on the buyer side, so managing contracts, negotiating contracts, procuring contracts. I could have left the world of contracting as a hero, but to quote Batman, I stuck around long enough to become a villain. So today I hope to take you through the process of contracting and how it works in the world of public procurement as a government official.
Great, thank you. So we have a lovely mix of practitioners and academics, and I think we're going to start immediately with presentations. I think you need this, and you need a clicker, which is there.
Well, thank you. Again, I'm Ben Brunges from the University of Washington. And today I'm going to be talking with you about a project that I started as a policy fellow with the U.S. Small Business Administration Office of Policy Planning and Liaison. For those of you who are not necessarily aware, the Small Business Administration, essentially their role is to do something different with procurement than many other organizations do with procurement. Rather than focusing on efficiency or getting the best deal, the SBA's job is to make sure that we allocate contract dollars in a way that's equitable and fair. And so the SBA was founded after the Small Business Act of 1953, and in the early history of the department or the agency, their programs revolved around particularly only small business, so ensuring that small business have access to government contracts. The rationale there, of course, is that larger businesses are going to have more resources, they'll be better able to navigate government procurement processes. And so by creating a series of programs and systems that allow small businesses access to that system, not only are we preserving the competitiveness of the marketplace, but we're also doing some social good, right? We're investing in firms that might grow and hire people and contribute more broadly to the economy. Now, those programs started focused on small business, and then we added disadvantaged business to our portfolio of programs that we cared about. And in the United States, this is the SBA 8A program. And these are businesses that are owned and operated by minorities of various different backgrounds. But in the late 90s, the Small Business Administration confronted a new challenge, and this is allocating contracts to veteran-owned small firms. This is a different take on social equity than we have in other programs. So rather than trying to counteract historical discrimination and social ill, contracts for veteran-owned businesses are more like rewards for service, right? So it's kind of finding deserving groups and making sure they get access to public procurement. So this series of acts was passed, and along the way, the federal government created a new target for spending with service-disabled veteran-owned small firms, 3%. As part of this 3% goal, then they created a set-aside program, essentially saying that if there are certain conditions met, the government would set aside contracts for these service-disabled veteran-owned small businesses. By 2012, it became clear that the federal government wasn't meeting these goals regularly. And so a small firm, Kingdomware Technologies, brought a case against the U.S. federal government saying that they should spend more money with service-disabled veteran-owned small businesses. The core of this case is what's known as the Rule of Two. So according to the set-aside program in the Department of Veterans Administration, if there are two small service-disabled veteran-owned businesses that could win a government contract or a VA contract, and the government plans to pay a going rate, then that contract needs to be set aside that is reserved for these service-disabled veteran-owned small firms. Kingdomware argued that the VA was not doing this, right? That they weren't actually setting aside contracts for these small firms. They were essentially violating this Rule of Two. So again, the Rule of Two is there need to be at least two firms that could submit bids, and the government needs to be willing to pay a fair and reasonable price. So Kingdomware brought suit, and eventually the Supreme Court ruled in favor of this small firm. They said, yes, actually, the Department of Veterans Affairs, because of the language in the law that was passed, needs to apply this rule to every single public procurement, right? Every single one within the Department of Veterans Affairs. So my question for this research is, how did changing that rule affect the allocation of government contracts, right? Do we see an increase in the use of service-disabled, veteran, and small businesses following this new rule? The data here, this is just very quick. I use contract level data from the United States federal government using a difference in differences analysis, where essentially I'm using a natural experiment, and I compare VA to the Department of Health and Human Services. Both organizations primarily focus on social services revolving around healthcare. And the data set includes 912,000 contracts, both 2 years prior and 2 years after the moment that the rule went into place. I perform an analysis overall using all these contracts, and then I break them down into competitiveness quartiles. So you can see what happens in different levels of market competition. The enforcement date is the middle of July in 2016. So what do we find here? Well, first, of course, because it's difference in differences, we need to look at parallel trends. The assumption is that something happens beforehand and these two departments are moving in a similar direction. And then after that inflection point, then we see some sort of change. And here you can see for all these four different kinds of businesses that are regularly the beneficiaries of set-asides, that the parallel trends assumption holds relatively well. So top left, service-disabled, veteran-owned small businesses. Bottom left, veteran-owned businesses. We're looking at that slope that's inside the circle. As long as they're pretty close, we can say that our assumption of parallel trends is matching. And it appears to be the case here. So what do we find? How does the rule of two affect the use of service-disabled, veteran-owned small businesses? My clicker has stopped working. There we go. Oh, all right. Well, so the analysis shows that enforcing the rule of two led to an overall 6.1% increase in the use of set-asides at the VA versus at the Department of Health and Human Services. An increase of 7.64% in the use of service-disabled, veteran-owned small businesses, and a 7.32% increase in the use of veteran-owned businesses. However, women-owned small businesses and minority-owned small businesses do not experience similar bumps, right? They're not benefiting from this particular program. What does this mean in terms of the actual number of new contracts that are allocated? About 2,500 new contracts at VA went to service-disabled veteran, or pardon me, were set aside, of which about 2,300 went to service-disabled veteran and veteran-owned small firms, right? So again, this is a substantial amount of contract activity. Women-owned small businesses lost about 10 contracts, and SBA 8A firms, these are the disadvantaged minority-owned firms, saw a slight increase. What about in terms of the total amount of spending? And this is, of course, what VA was really curious in, was like, what is the actual dollar amount that we're changing here? About $700 million, new $1 million in that 2-year period went to these service-disabled, veteran-owned small businesses. Again, not much impact on the other firms. So we also might wonder here about what this looks like in markets, because it's likely that if we are using service-disabled, veteran-owned small firms more commonly, that we're going to be using them in industries where they're already being used, right? We're simply going to hire more veteran-owned firms to do the same kinds of work. I'm sorry, the clicker is not moving my slide. There we go. So here we have marginal effects by quartile. So here I've separated out industries by quartile of competitiveness. That is, ahead of the decision, what percentage of contracts were already going to small service-disabled, veteran-owned small businesses. And you can see so Q1 is that's where they're most common, and Q4 that's where they're least common. For set-asides overall, and for service-disabled, veteran-owned small firms and veteran-owned businesses, all of them across all quartiles saw an increase. Of course, the greatest increase here is in Q2. That is, so there are firms that were being used in those marketplaces, but maybe they were being underused. But in general, if we look at the impact across markets and levels of market competition, we see evidence that enforcing this rule of two had benefits for these small firms. So then what are the big takeaways for you all in this room here? Well, of course, this is about discretion. This rule essentially is forcing public managers to apply a procurement rule in a way that they might not necessarily apply with their own decision making. Clearly, they weren't applying it this way beforehand. So when we eliminate that discretion from public managers, rather than choosing efficiency-related motivations to allocate contracts, such as blanket contracts and blanket purchasing agreements, these kinds of things. Instead, public procurement officials are choosing to work more commonly with small businesses. For those of you who were here this morning, we can think about this in the context of the clock and the cloud, right? So this is a clock mechanism. We're really looking at a really nitty-gritty kind of detailed procedural change. Are we forcing people to do something or not? And in this case, we start doing it. But when we do that, what we're doing is we're influencing the way that they advance essentially our cloud objectives, right? Our cloud objective here is we want to contribute more broadly to society. We want to make the allocation of contracts more fair. So here, by enforcing a rule, we're able to then better advance those broader societal objectives. For those of you who make policy, I think it's important to remember that as you make policy around procurement, that these administrators are balancing complex value choices. And it's really easy for them to fall back on the efficiency training that they have received, right? I care about cost, I care about effectiveness, I care about making sure that this goes out quickly. And that's not necessarily the case when you're dealing with smaller businesses. You got to find them, you got to work with them, you got to train them. But if we take away their discretion, then they choose to use, they use these service-disabled firms more commonly. So I think the big takeaway point here is that discretion is not neutral. Right, in our procurement system, it's laden with values. So thank you.
Thank you very much. You got a little bit of extra time because of the clicker, but I encourage everyone to stick to time. We're giving everybody 7 minutes for these presentations, and then we'll collect questions, and then we'll go around again.
Okay, thank you very much. So today, first of all, I'd like to start with a disclaimer. I've been doing this research in the past few weeks, so I'm aware there's space for improvement. So my research focuses on the interconnection between intellectual property and public procurement. Besides the conventional IP mechanisms such as patents, copyrights, trademarks, there's also this special category known as traditional knowledge and cultural expressions. And this category covers a wide array of different considerations and manifestations such as folklore, but not only about art, but also about buildings, traditional building techniques, traditional agriculture, and usually these traditional knowledge and cultural expressions are held by communities, local communities, and indigenous communities. So the question is whether procuring authorities can or should take into account this consideration throughout the procurement cycle. And this question has not really been studied in the literature, so there's little research on this specific question. What has been studied is more about the protection of traditional knowledge and traditional cultural expressions in the realm of intellectual property. And of course, they need protection in the sense that they might be misused by non-members of the community. And this is just one of the examples. And there are two main schools of thought. For one, conventional IP mechanisms such as patents and copyrights can be effectively used to protect the traditional knowledge and cultural expressions. For a second school of thought, it's not possible, so all these mechanisms should be adapted, or instead dedicated frameworks should be developed and adapted. And this because traditional knowledge and cultural expressions have very special and unique characteristics. So usually they are not related to individual, new, or innovative creations, but it's something that has passed down through generations within a time frame that is not easily determinable and is usually longer than the duration of most intellectual property rights. So looking at the public procurement, the inclusion of traditional knowledge and cultural expressions is not really a straightforward exercise. Examples are more likely to be found in sectors such as traditional agriculture, traditional medicine sometimes, or whenever the community-based approach is used. And in this case, a community-based procurement may rely on traditional building techniques, for instance. In some countries, what I found is that there are some guidance on intellectual property and public procurement. But in this case, we are talking more about the conventional IP mechanisms, patents, copyrights, etc. There's almost nothing about traditional knowledge and traditional cultural expressions. In other terms, procuring entities don't have any guidance when they have to deal with such issues, and there's no assessment or template for assessment. As part of my research, I tried to develop a very first draft of such a template for the assessment of traditional knowledge and cultural expressions in public procurement. And basically, this could be divided into two main parts. The first part is more about the general legal framework. So is there any provision in the realm of intellectual property relating to traditional knowledge and cultural expressions? Is there any provisions in the public procurement laws and regulations? And then there's a second part of this assessment where each individual procurement should be assessed in order to see whether to understand what is the purpose of the procurement. Is there any local or indigenous community that can be affected by such public intervention? And what is the impact? So is there a risk in terms of misappropriation of traditional knowledge? Or if we take into account traditional knowledge and cultural expression, is there a risk of having long procedure, longer than usual? Another point, it doesn't work anymore. Yes. The second point is about the language that procuring entities use. Of course, here I'm not saying that we shouldn't use a bureaucratic or legalistic vocabulary, but sometimes I think that procuring entities should use complementary tools such as storytelling. Storytelling can be used by procuring entities to communicate their intentions, requirements, and also potential benefits of including traditional knowledge and cultural expressions in procurement processes. On the other hand, storytelling can also help procuring authorities to understand traditions and cultural elements from which traditional knowledge and cultural expressions originate. And this is crucial for ensuring that procurement outcomes align with local values and are accepted by communities. Doesn't work. The last slide is about the next steps of my research. You cannot see them on the screen, but
Michael, can you click on for us?
as a next step of my research, I'd like to, first of all, try to test and validate the assessment template to see whether it can be used to cover the diversity of traditional knowledge and cultural expressions, because there are different manifestations, both tangible, intangible, fixed, unfixed. So this is one point. The second point is whether there are examples of the inclusion of such traditional knowledge and cultural expressions in procurement. So I'd like to collect these examples. And another point is whether we could define a third category of sustainable public procurement beyond the well-known socially responsible procurement and green public procurement. This third category could be the culturally sensitive procurement. I'm aware that this one could be defined under the umbrella of socially responsible procurement, but when it comes to traditional knowledge, this is a transversal topic. For instance, local and indigenous communities have a strong knowledge of how to deal with the environment, and this can be applicable, for instance, in traditional agriculture. So this is in between, and so it would be interesting to see whether it makes sense to have a third category of culturally sensitive procurement. And last question, if we can better define the role of storytelling in public procurement. So this is my final
Thank you
word.
very much.
Thank you.
Kit.
Thank you. No, I don't have any slides. Everyone will be relieved to hear because I definitely can't work a clicker. So I was just going to give some thoughts to help prompt discussion, I hope, more than anything else, around the procurement practitioner's perspective. And obviously from my own perspective, that means as a lawyer working in public procurement. And the first thing I thought about was, well, what does relationalism mean in the context of the practice of public procurement? And what does it mean in the context of social value and social outcomes in that context? And the reason you have to ask that is because I think historically, certainly at the beginning of my career, people would have been quite frightened to hear you talk to a lawyer or about the concept of relationism and building relationships and building supply chains in the context of delivery of public procurement, because there was a fear that that way is how you get bribery and corruption and improper relationships and engagement with the supply chain and with the market. And I'm very pleased to say that I don't think that's true, but I also think there's a recognition in the market globally that that is not true. And what we should have is appropriate, professional and structured relationships and engagement with the market. And I think that that's recognised, for example, so I'm a UK-based lawyer, and in the UK we have a new Procurement Act, and that a number of people are going to talk about. And in support of that, we also have a national procurement policy statement. And actually the importance of social value, of outcome-based procurement, but also relationalism and relationships is expressly recognised in there. And if you look at the kind of strategic objectives that are set out there, they include, not just value for money, not just efficiency, the points that you were talking about, which is kind of the ingrained history, I think, of some of procurement. But actually they talk about social value, and they talk about support for SMEs. They talk about commercial and procurement delivery, but they talk about that in the context of skills and capability building. So there's a recognition that to deliver effective procurement, and that can also include efficient and valuable in terms of value for money procurement, you have to have your supply chain, and you have to have capacity and capability within that supply chain. So that's my first point. The second is, well, what does it look like when you're actually doing it? And I think that's something we've all struggled with. And the first is a fear of talking to the market, because there's been a concept of conflict of interest, there's been a concept of kind of improper bias, there's been a concept of perhaps bias towards, certain suppliers in your region or in your country that's not kind of in accordance with trade law or in accordance with your regulatory regime. So what I think has happened to support that engagement, and it should be thought of as support, is rules around engagement. And those rules should be thought about permissive ability to engage with markets. It should be talking about market testing within a framework, market testing when you're not frightened to use your discretion in a way that you actually think delivers outcomes because you don't know what that means and no one's taught you. And there is a renewed focus, I think, on market engagement or early market engagement under the Procurement Act as an example. The rules aren't actually very different, but there's different language around it. And it's expressly recognised in the Cabinet Office recent guidance that there is particular importance in early and effective market engagement where there is increased flexibility and discretion in procurement processes. Because if you don't know what you're getting or what you want, if you don't know what good looks like for the market, if you don't know what's out there, how are you going to set up an effective process if you have the flexibility to design what you want? So go and talk to people early, but do it in a way that kind of allays the fears of corruption, bribery, inappropriate engagement, conflict. And the reason why it's important to have those rules, and a lawyer would say that, is because if you don't, people like me will advise those people participating in those procurement processes not to engage, not to open up, not to share their learning, because there will be a fear that that will mean they're offside in the future or unable to participate in really, really important market-leading procurement processes. So everyone needs to get comfortable. And it's obviously about the history of where everyone comes from, but that is there already, and it's the point you were talking about kind of people's kind of perception of what they're trying to achieve. But we can help them to feel comfortable to do this if we help them understand the flexibility that they have. So that was the first stage. Then there's the stage of actually selecting your participating bodies and your entities, and that's about understanding what your bidding entity is. So I only deal with very, very significant, very, very large public contracts, but the reality of that is how you bring SMEs and other kind of enterprises that you want to support into that is through the supply chain. So we need to help our big, big, big public contractors to effectively engage and support the supply chain to ensure supply chain resilience in whatever market we're working in. And that means we have to understand how we do that, who those people are, what their issues are, what we need to pay them, when we need to pay them, and all of those things that really builds proper supply chain resilience. And the Act, again, starts to look at that a bit better, I think. Perhaps not a kind of on its face. There's all kinds of things now, for example, about, corruption and bribery and debarment, where you have to, as the prime contractor, really talk about your supply chain and really think about who you're going to use and talk about that upfront. So it just encourages a different level of thinking. And then I think, I suppose, just in my 7 minutes, so I'm going to keep to.
Thank you.
The final point was, well, what about actual contract performance and flexibility and discretion in contract performance? So for the UK, for the first time, apart from one minor point, we actually use procurement legislation to govern contract performance. It looks into the contract stage. And what it says is you have to set KPIs and you have to report and all these types of things. But the reality is that means you have to have a long-term relationship that's governed by procurement law, not just a long-term relationship on a contracting or contracting authority basis. This is establishing a different way of creating a relationism within public procurement. But the only way that anyone is going to make that effective, and I go back to the point about people like me advising their clients not to engage, is that you need to trust each other. You need to understand what that information is being used for to actually get the transparency and the information that you want from these new provisions about contract performance. So my hopefully positive view is that there's all kinds of opportunity for public procurement to be supportive of these outcomes, but we might need to help people feel comfortable, and sometimes rules can be helpful.
Thank you.
I do have slides, Michael. Michael, if I can't advance, I'll ask you to advance for me. So this research, I'll be able to just give you an overview, and kind of the bottom line of the research today is joint with all four of us actually met each other here through work at the GoLab, and Stefan Sassiers right there. And Fernando's back in Brazil now, and Mehdi is here in Europe as well. So we're going to talk about our research on looking at the interplay of discretion when it's allowed in public procurement, but also looking at how the complexity of the contracting relationships, so the transactional complexity, affects the role of discretion. And we're going to look in particular at, it did work. Okay. At particular outcomes I'll talk about in a minute. So I don't need to emphasize the first point very much. We're all here because we understand how important public procurement is. But the fact that it represents on average 12 to 14% of a country's GDP is major. And as we also know that many public procurement contracts are renegotiated frequently. And the renegotiation process can also involve large amounts of public funds, additional public sector costs, and renegotiation is done for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it could be a positive motivation, for example, productively adapting to maybe technological change or other things, but oftentimes it's also negative. Think of COVID, what happened to contracting, or as has been mentioned, the concerns about potential for corruption or opportunism among relationships. So in this research, we, as I mentioned, look at two important features of contracts and contract procedures, whether discretion is allowed in contract procedures at the time of the contract award. So that would be embedded in the criteria for selecting the awardee. And we specifically, since I won't be talking in detail about how we measure these things, but that's really, you can think of the alternative between having to go with the lowest price contract versus being allowed to consider other factors. And contract complexity we measure in terms of the transactional. So think of how many parties are there to the contract? Are they multi-layered in terms of subcontractors and other dimensions? So we create a scalar measure of complexity. And what we're looking at is how we assess their influence on the point of contract negotiations. How are the relationships perceived at the time of renegotiation, the sentiment, which was done with a sentiment analysis, how it's managed. So I think it was mentioned, how long to renegotiation, right? So we had hoped that maybe if relationships were more fruitful, you might find ways to productively adapt without having to go to renegotiation. And then also we look at the valuation at the time of renegotiation. Does it increase or decrease the value of contract? I won't be speaking to those results today because there's only so much I can fit in 7 minutes and 5 slides. Okay, there we go. And so the theory, as I mentioned, we have is that allowing discretion contract award procedures should promote selection of contractors that are more conducive to developing relational aspects, more cooperative behavior in contract and management. So the hope is that you could look at these other dimensions of your perspective of contractors and procurement and select one where you think there, as you were suggesting, an opportunity to work more cooperative and collaborative throughout, what is often a complex set of transactions. At the same time, we recognize that when there's complexity, particularly transactional complexity, in the partnership between the government and the private sector, and oftentimes there are multiple partners, that this could make it more challenging, right? As it was talked about this morning, bringing your interests versus your positions to the process, but that's often challenging because positions are real. People have different levels of authority in a contracting process. So we developed some hypotheses that we test empirically, and maybe need to talk faster here. With higher levels of discretion, contracting parties will approach renegotiation with a more positive cooperative orientation versus deceptive or opportunistic behavior, and that the first time to renegotiation to renegotiation will be longer. Trying to get this thing to cooperate again. Shoot at Michael. Okay, maybe I have to point it at Michael. And as I mentioned, higher levels of transactional complexity will moderate that role of discretion, possibly dampening the party's cooperative sentiment and reducing time to renegotiation. So what we did is we web scraped data from the European Union on major contract modification notices. And you can see the time period there, merged that with detailed data on the contract awards. We have to focus on those contracts that had modifications. And so you can see there are over 12,000 contracts corresponding to about over 21,000 different contract modifications in analysis. So I'm going to skip all the empirical stuff, all the tests. We do some tests to rule out the possibility that corruption could explain our findings. We don't think that's the case. So what we find, and so these two graphs here, what you're seeing is on the horizontal axis is the complexity index. That's the transactional complexity. On the vertical axis is the marginal effective discretion on the sentiment, the score we use to characterize sentiment on the left hand, and on the right hand, it's time to renegotiation. So you see is that high discretion, and so that would be, so where the effect is of high discretion. So high discretion of the contract award stage positively and precisely predicts renegotiation sentiment and time to renegotiation. But when you factor in transactional complexity, it reduces that positive association. So that negative relationship you see there is as the contracts become more complex, it dampens the positive effect of the discretion. So you can see that for sentiment, you have to be much more complex, right, before it fully takes away the positive benefits of discretion, but less so on time to renegotiation, right? So the complexity means that higher complexity, the more complexity, you quickly lose that advantage of a shorter time to renegotiation, which I think makes sense. Okay, pointing again at Michael, try. There we go. So to sum up, oops, I just clicked again. Okay, to sum up, our findings suggest that governments are probably too beholden to strict procurement rules that discourage discretion, and that we may be foregoing important benefits of discretion that could lead to improvement efficiencies and relationships among the contracting parties. Contract complexity, as we know, imposes challenges for collaboration and contracting. It's just a fact of life. The straightforward, simple transactions are easier to manage. At the same time, we from our research discourage the typical response to layer on more strict rigidities, guidelines, clauses that we know from other research we're doing can undermine the benefits of discretion. And so we suggest that we think discretion is probably underutilized, and that with our experience of turbulent times as we had in COVID and in other ways, that it's could be important for us to figure out how to do this better. So
Thank you, Carolyn. Jane.
Thank you. Okay, can I do next slide, please, instead? That works better, I think. Okay, so first of all, let's address what we're here for, to talk about revolutionary, responsible, and relational in public procurement. So I think, first of all, to be revolutionary, we'll address that in a moment, sorry. To be responsible, I've never yet to meet a procurement person who doesn't want to do the right thing. I think that actually to be relationalism, I think it's about the pan here, but I think that's the linchpin between both being revolutionary and being responsible. I came out with what I think 6 challenges, but of 7 minutes to talk about them. I've narrowed it down to 3. So shows you a snapshot of some of the definitions that I've pulled out on defining social value. And I think this kind of really demonstrates the challenge that we face when we think about outcomes and what, because if we think about the definitions that you see there, they nearly all include the pillars of what we identify as sustainability: societal, economic, environmental, cultural. But actually, in reality, when you try and implement all of those, one comes a compromise of another. So what we've got to be thinking about here is relevance and, is timeliness in terms of, and also thinking about the category of spend where one may be more relevant than another. So I think we need to think really about what it is that we're really trying to achieve here through procurement as the lever to address these and clearly communicate that. Move on to the second one, please, if that's okay. The second one is, I've gone a bit too far. I think we're going all over the place now. Anyway, we're on legislation now. There should be a slide on legislation. It's great fun, this. I love it. The second challenge is embedding legislation. So really excited about the Procurement Act, which takes effect from the 28th of October. There's a lot of very positive outcomes from that. Number one, that this is our chance to be revolutionary, to make it work for the UK and to deliver better outcomes through procurement. I think definitely having the 12-month pipeline of contract opportunities that may come up is really positive. Take in economic, so meet to mat, the most economically advantageous tender to most advantageous tender is very exciting. I think the emphasis on performance contracting is also an interesting development. But the reality is that if we, in Wales, we have an awful lot of guidance. And what we've really learned is that, yes, it's great to have that guidance, but actually making it happen in practice, the how to, is often quite challenging. The next slide will give you an illustration of that one. So in Wales, we're one of the first countries, if you're not already familiar with it, to legislate well-being as a nation. And how we deliver that through procurement. I supported the Future Generations Commissioner back in 2020. Well, it was a 2-year project. And we basically reviewed the extent to which wellbeing was embedded in procurement across the Welsh public sector. What it demonstrated is that it was not so easy. We got the guidance, knowing where to find the guidance, but actually how to deliver it in practice when you're trying to juggle all of these things is quite difficult. But actually what I would encourage really when it comes to legislation is this emphasis on review and how important the review was. So if you want to be truly revelationary, I think we do need to pause for reflection and review, because actually sometimes that's the trigger of change. So this review in itself, by questioning, by interviewing, by developing case study material, was actually a trigger of change for those that were perhaps less developed in this area. And that's been confirmed in some recent research where we're seeing quite significant progress being made in a few years ahead. So if we move on to the next slide here, my third challenge is measurement. And I think that, really this is about links to the first point about how we define our outcomes and then how we measure them. So a piece of work that I'm doing currently with Welsh Government is aligning our national indicators, which came from the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. There are 50 in total. We're looking at then which ones of those are relevant to developing our foundational economy, and then starting to think about how that then translates to one of our strategic priorities in Wales is about fair work and employability, for more inclusive employability. So what we need to see, if we keep introducing all these new policies, these new ideas, we must align them. And I think that's really important for us. So I think that those are the three main challenges as I see them. If we just go to the next slide, thank you. And then I just really want to pull out. So this is a report that I've recently published with the Wales Centre for Public Policy and Welsh Government. And we're defining social value and understanding social value and what it means. And I just want to pull out a couple of points there. I think I'm within my 7 minutes. I think I just written in here, I'd like to encourage public bodies to ensure clear communication of what their strategic priorities are, both within procurement teams, which sounds obvious, but also within the supply market as well. And I don't think that has happened so well and is so consistent, but maybe this act will encourage that with the emphasis on more supplier engagement. I think the value of collaborating across sector, particularly with the VCSEs in supply chain. So don't underestimate the value of micro firms, ethnic minority-owned firms, voluntary organisations. Procurement hasn't got the answer to everything, but if we partner well with agencies like this, those are closest to the community and understanding community needs, which will better inform us when we're making decisions on contract opportunities. And I think there needs to be greater emphasis on early supplier engagement, but to encourage peer learning amongst the suppliers. And I think this was a point which was brought up in the previous track session, keeping the language simple, clear and consistent. And I think that's really where I am going to stop at 7 minutes. Thank you.
Thanks, Jane. Michal?
Thank you. So my presentation is focused on sustainable public procurement in Czech and Slovak Republic. I believe that green public procurement is a nice example of relational contact because of its complexity. Generally, government today are setting up very ambitious targets regarding implementation of green public procurement. Local government are often important actor in many decentralized contexts. Unfortunately, policymakers at central level are not aware of day-to-day realities of how local government working. And our presentation would like to show us the importance of starting condition, control mechanism, and also factors like institutionalization. It means how green public procurement are written in the main strategic document of municipalities. Maybe we can move to the next slide. Okay. We can see that the share of green public procurement in Czech and Slovak Republic is just about 2 or 4%. To be honest, we have no proper monitoring, so this is a rough estimation. What is interesting, it's the level of decentralization in Czech and Slovak Republic. We have about 6,200 municipalities in Czech Republic, and in Slovak we have 2,800. It means that average number of inhabitants in Czech municipalities is about 1,000. Maybe we can move to the next slide. So I think that it's really important if we talk about Czech Republic and generally in Central European context. It's important to understand basic narratives which characterize public procurement system. It means that monitoring is focused on inputs. It's quite different from public value in UK because Czech monitoring system does not take into account outputs or outcomes. It means that formal contract dominate. There is a lack of trust. When I read the newspaper today, the main heading was that 10 hospital manager was arrested because of corruption in public procurement. And some specific factor which is characteristic for post-communist country is zero error tolerance culture. It means that good performance are something like standard, but bad performance are amplified by a newspaper, and it means that procurers manager show significant risk aversion to the public procurement process. Some few words about the methodology. We have standardized questionnaire. It was developed by Sustainable Purchasing Research Initiative. It allows us to compare our results with a similar country like Italy, Spain. We obtain about 400 answers. We can move to the next slide. So, main result. You can see that very small proportion of local municipalities have policies related to sustainability. They also do not monitor expenditure on sustainability and also does not set any environmental goal. I must say that these results may be even worse because they can be inflated by structure of our sample. And you can also see that the main motivation for implementation of green public procurement are still subsidized from European Union. Main policies are focused on energy efficiency and waste management. We can move to the next slide. What is really interesting that key actors are politicians. It means local mayors. Not central government, not non-profit sector, not businesses. I would also stress the importance of capacity. It means that local government need finance and also human resources. It means educated people and enough people which are working in public procurement processes. The most important criterium are still lowest price. And we can also see some share, which is not statistically significant, of procurers which prefer previous experience with firms. And of course, local governments are still not able to assess the success of implementation of green public procurement. We can move to the next slide. And there is some lessons learned regarding rational contract. I strongly believe that those type of contract is not applicable at every system because it strongly depends on some some starting condition. I mean that we need to develop a good monitoring system. We need to have local leadership, and also we need to build capacities. I strongly believe that these results are applicable for majority of Central and Eastern European countries. And regarding the level of decentralization, we should also take into account the heterogeneity of government. We can observe some nice best practices in large municipalities, but small municipalities can be still in trouble because they do not have capacity to implement all these tools. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Seema?
Thank you very much. So for my slides, I'm hoping today to take you through the process for a day in the life of a commercial officer, commercial manager in government. What I hope to do is to show you what it's like to operate in this role, and also to see how relationships change over the contracting process, how they grow, how they develop, how they move. Failing that, I hope to crowdsource some free therapy. So thank you for being here. That's the start of my procurement process, my contracting process there. All I can see is the roller coaster, and I have my stakeholders who often start with a very positive relationship with their suppliers. So they're subject matter experts, they've been working with these suppliers for a long time, they understand them, they work well, and they work positively. And I come in and I offer to take them through that roller coaster to test that relationship, potentially to replace it with another supplier. If I could move to the next slide. And that's me essentially there. Moving and breaking relationships and replacing them and changing things around. Because ultimately, from my perspective, we've got, whilst those positive relationships are useful to have, those relationships aren't necessarily between organizations, they're between people. Ultimately, what we were looking to replicate in those positive relationships isn't a fantastic supplier, it's those fantastic account managers, those fantastic consultants, those fantastic workers who are doing that work, who are delivering that work for us. And that relationship is between people, it's not between organizations. Organizations are very different. Organizations have profit margins, they have cost-saving targets, they work in a very different way, and they think in a different way. So when you've got a fantastic relationship between people in a contracting organization, in a buying organization, and a fantastic relationship with the supplier side, what you've not got necessarily is fantastic relationships between contracting organizations, between businesses. If I can move to the next slide, please. And that's where it's important to really understand what it is you want and what it is you're entering into a contract for and what it is you're asking the supplier to deliver. Because whilst you might have a positive relationship, think of it this way. What would happen if those positive, enthusiastic, fantastic staff members leave, move on to different jobs, get promoted? Or worse, imagine what happens when C-suite gets together and huddled over a spreadsheet miles away from delivery, they look around and they say, why are we investing all that time, energy, resource into that particular contract when we could be using all these people to win us new work, win us bigger contracts, win us better contracts? Why spend all that time? What's to stop that C-suite from taking that contract and that relationship entirely for granted? And that's where I come in from my perspective as a commercial manager, and that's where you all come in for today. Our role as commercial practitioners is to define that relationship. It is to measure it. It is to manage it. And when that happens and you're in a position where C-suite doesn't want to do anything, doesn't want to carry on the contract in the way it's always done, or your supplier can't deliver in the way it's always done, all you have left is your contract. Or more precisely, all you have left is the commitments that are stated clearly in your contract. My role as a buyer is not to disrupt the relationship, but it is to be realistic about how it's delivered and how it's managed. Good is often defined in terms of spirit. Some standard engineering contracts, for example, begin with a commitment for mutual trust and cooperation. But when your relationship is subject to variables, like the ones I've outlined, good needs to be measured in measurable behaviors, or defined in measurable behaviors, rather. Looking at ensuring positive relationships, the behaviors and expectations need to be clear, they need to be defined, and they need to be measured. Otherwise, how can you be sure they're really there? And how can you be sure that relationship really exists? And how can you guard that relationship against all those external forces that might dismantle it? Can we move on to the next slide, please? That there is my attempt at defining various contracts over the years. It's everything from trying to remove processes to stop relationships sort of being onerous and creating far too many obligations in terms of process, but also being very clear that where a deliverable is necessary, that it is clearly articulated, like in the case of the astronauts there. Move on to the next slide. Ultimately, from our perspective, that relationship needs to be managed throughout the contract process, throughout that roller coaster, and then some at the end of the contract, when you might be looking at exit strategies and managing the end of that contract. If there is another way outside of contracts and describing things, and if anyone does have a magic wand that can cast a spell over my contracts, I'd be very keen to hear from you at the end. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. We're going to switch up for the next half hour. We're going to take some questions as a batch, and then we're going to go around the room and get some rapid reflections from our panelists here. It's striking to me, though, that a lot of the discussion here is not focused on the process of awarding or running a competition and doing awarding. A lot of the conversation here has been about things long before the competition and things long after the award, which I think is sometimes missed in people's perception of what public procurement's all about. People perceive it as being, run a competition and do an award. And actually, a lot of the things we expect of our public procurement professionals, is a lot of this stuff before and then, long after. And my question to the group would be about the capacity of people to do that. Do we actually have the people in place to be able to do those things yet, if that's what we expect? But let me stop there with my own comments and look around the room. See one over there. I promised Malcolm Harbour a quick question. And then we'll jump to you if that's okay. So Malcolm, you're a former MEP. You led the committee that sort of was responsible for the Procurement Act, or European Procurement Directive. What's your take on all this?
Well, I'll try and be very brief, but I think the first thing is it's fascinating that given the same set of rules, the number of different outcomes that we've explored today. And I'm also reasonably familiar. I was very interested in the presentation from America because I went to the Small Business Administration quite a few years ago when I was really interested in what they were doing in encouraging small businesses, which I'd like to come back to later. But I had a more fundamental point, first of all. And I found those cartoons fascinating. I hope I can have a copy of those, actually. But it seems to me that part of the issue for people in contracting is actually to spend more time with your internal client, finding out what they actually want in the first place. I'm really passionate about the fact that we're not exploiting the use of public procurement as an instrument for making change, and particularly for delivering things like zero carbon, improving zero carbon performance, social value, and so on. And I think it's important that we have too much compartmentalization about all of these issues. So two points linked to this. First of all, I think we get better outcomes if we integrate the whole ideas about delivering so-called social value properly into the whole process. The problem we have, particularly in the UK, is the Social Value Act was always completely divorced from the actual contracting process. Now we're using in the UK a policy statement, and I think others are doing that, so that all of these things have to be taken into account. But what it really does need, of course, is a far better pre-contractual process. And that's where we have to get the customer to define exactly what they do want in the first place. Because the whole tendency is for some customers, and you illustrated it perfectly, is that they come along with an idea of what they want and what technology is available, and they say, buy that. When I started working in the car industry as an engineer, I used to do my drawings, and that was what happened. But it doesn't happen anymore in the private sector. If I wanted to get a new design, I'd get someone in who would take responsibility for doing the design, producing the prototypes, testing them, making sure they're right standards, putting them into production, coming back to me when I need to change to make it cheaper, and then deliver the final solution. And we need to think far more in relations about these longer term contracts. And what this is my concluding point.
Okay.
You're not going to get a real improvement unless you really think about how to design the contract in a more interactive way with your chosen supplier, or maybe with two chosen suppliers. Because actually, if you look at particularly the contracts delivering things like social impact, it's all about that joint design of contract, because that's how you get better and longer term and more sustainable outcomes.
Thank you very much. That was more of a comment than a question. So, you're welcome to pull up a chair. Okay, that's the question. Thank you. Do you want to introduce yourself and give the question, please?
Hi, Janet Phillipson from Prison and Probation Service. So my question is about, do you have any tips for how we evaluate at bid stage for commitment to social goals and outcomes as a kind of value, and also how we evaluate for bringing in like a diversity of organizations? Because I guess one of my concerns is that we have usually a procurement process which is very winner takes all, and actually we've got a fantastic varied sector, and to choose one of them for the next several years, if you want to have a long-term relational contract, you don't want to exclude all of them who will all have like really valuable things to bring. So yeah, any tips on how we design an evaluation process to do that?
Thank you. Other questions in the room before we go online? Oh, yeah. Let's wait for the microphone, please.
Hello, Sam Magney from the National Lottery Community Fund. Do we have a problem with the acronym VCSE? Is the question. The context of the question is it lumps together a load of things, including what I'm describing as a liminal field of social enterprise, which in some people's book means every kind of business. So, and there's been a lot of talk in the circle here about procurement as a tool to deal with markets, but the V and the C and some of the SE isn't a market. So is it unhelpful to use the term VCSE when discussing when or when not to use procurement?
Thank you. Excellent question. You're pointing to online? Sorry. Oh, Ollie, please.
Thank you very much. I'm Ole Petersen. I'm a researcher from Denmark. So I enjoyed the talk very much. And I have a specific question to you, Jane, from Fresh Fields. I really enjoyed your way of phrasing relationalism. So it's not about public buyers and private sellers becoming friends or being friends, but it's about professional relationalism. I think that's a really great way of saying it. So in the country I'm from, and I think in many countries in Europe, law departments are separated out from social science. And I think this causes some concerns among researchers and practitioners of relational contracting. Because if we write our contracts in more relational, professional relational ways, social scientists and practitioners are concerned that lawyers are going to interpret, or how are they going to interpret our more relational contracts? So my question is sort of, in the UK, do you have experience of, is there like a public procurement complaints board, for example? I mean, these complaint boards, they usually take on many more cases than the courts do. Or is there any sort of legal precedents that would talk to kind of law or legal interpretations of relational contracts that could comfort some of the social science people here, that lawyers would actually do understand some of the mechanisms we try to put into the contracts? Yeah, sorry.
Thank you. Great question. Should we go online just to, we've got, no, I think you should be doing that as well.
How many are we going to have before?
They're not, okay. Let's take just a couple more. So Michael, do you want to decide where they're coming from?
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Yeah, it's Liam Sloan here from Public Digital. I'm interested that, you know, social outcomes are almost by definition, we're talking about types of services where we don't necessarily know what works in order to achieve those outcomes, and what might work today might not work in 2, 3, 4 years' time when that contract's still being delivered. And I'm interested from both the sort of legal perspective and also the contracting, you know, sort of lawyer perspective and also the contracting officer perspective, how you feel those types of contracts should be designed and articulated when the specification itself might change. And actually, coming back to our keynote this morning, we might want to be trying to optimize for learning rather than sort of efficiency and a fixed delivery model.
Thank you. Maybe one more? Have any more? No? Okay. Then let's go around. If you would take 2 to 3 minutes to respond to any of the questions that you strongly want to respond to. Thank you. Or if there is something that another person said that you really agree with, draw a connection there, or really disagree with as well. Ben.
Let's just start some controversy.
Sure.
First of all, thank you all. Really, really interesting work that you're all doing. I'll take the VCSE question and I'll try to respond to your question. Then I can do more if you want. So in the United States, we call these nonprofit organizations, I think is what we're talking about here. And there's a lot of research on nonprofits about benefits of working with them due to the kind of the goals that drive the organizations. There's empirical evidence.
Can I help you out with this one?
Go ahead.
Forgive me to interrupt. So VCSEs is in the UK. There's volunteer organizations, charitable organizations, and social enterprises. And
They're lumped together.
They're all lumped together, and it's unclear where the boundary of social enterprise is. So you don't have to be a nonprofit to be a social enterprise.
Okay.
And that, I think, is what Sam was getting at.
Interesting. So in the U.S., there are set-asides for those social enterprises, but we don't have set-asides for the community and volunteer organizations. But there's a lot of evidence that they perform really well as contractors, and they should be used more often than they currently are. To your question about sort of the social outcomes under uncertainty, I worry about this particularly much with public-private partnerships, where we're writing 30, 50, 100-year contracts for major public services with little effort or little ability to kind of restructure those relationships over time. So my advice for those of you who are doing this work is to build options into your contract. Rather than building a 30-year contract, build a 5-1 that you can extend for 5 more years once you learn about your vendor. But it's a real important concern.
So I think, and this is drawing from some other research, is because of uncertainty, that's why I was saying our tendency is often at the outset to try to anticipate and then build in the guardrails. Well, if this happens, and then we'll have this clause to deal with that if that comes up. And I think what we're learning, and Ole and others in the room are part of a kind of a workshop we had recently, is that that sometimes works against the adaptation that we need. And so one of the ideas that's been talked about, and it was mentioned this morning, David L. Carter mentioned David Friedlander's work on, what is the balance between formal and relational that we really need. And so if there can be, for example, and this is where the questions for the legal scholars and people with knowledge about the practice come in, is I think Ole was referring to this too. So what kind of principles can be built into contracts so it doesn't tell you what you do and penalize if you don't do that when this happens, but it says here's a principle which will guide our kind of renegotiations, adaptation, or whatever we need to do, right, at that point when those uncertainties come up. And can we, without having a specific clause that assigns authority and responsibility in specific activities, can we have principles that will be defensible in court and say, oh, we commit to collaborating and doing this at this point, even if it doesn't, set out specific obligations, which sometimes people want, right, to be able to protect themselves. So I don't know.
Sure, okay.
I will start with the capacity topic. In fact, capacity is often very sensitive. When it comes to public procurers, they are not risk takers, and that's the reason why guidance are useful and should be developed. And on another point, I agree that very often the debate is more on the planning stage and the design stage, but this is also reflected then in all the process. For instance, looking at the traditional knowledge or traditional cultural expressions, so we may see two different scenarios. One is communities can become contractors if they have the capacity, skills, and interest. And the second, if they cannot, in the contract, there must be specific clauses on the intellectual property protection. And this is just one example.
Thank you. Kit.
Okay, so the first one, I don't know what the acronym stands for, and I work in that industry and sector, so I think it needs changing. That was I don't know the answer though. So I think, so first of all, taking the very specific legal question around relational contracting and how that works in the context of public procurement. So it's the terms of contractor sector specific. And so you get markets where long-term relationships, PPPs, for example, you start getting established standard forms that have approaches of relational contracting because of their length. Obviously, in Europe, for PPPs, you have a balancing under civil law. So you have a balancing in the future. In the UK, we don't. And I'm sure in the States, it's probably similar to the UK. But for example, in the UK market for tunneling contracts, that sounds like it's not a huge market. It's a very, very consolidated market. It was very important in the UK because we did Crossrail and then we did Thames Tideway Tunnel. It became market standard that we use something called NEC3, which is a standard form contract that focuses on relationships and relational contracting and uses language at the beginning around kind of establishing that not formalistic contractual language, not liquidated damages for delay and all those types of things, like much more building relationships, not relational contracts in the legal sense, by the way, because that makes people very nervous, but in terms of long-term relationships and structures. So you can think properly, and this is your point, I think, actually, which I thought was very clear in my practice still. You should think at the beginning and early about what you want. And that should include the terms on which you want to contract and whether or not those terms can be used to establish long-term relationships that are progressive, meaningful, and can establish flexibility. Then to go to your point, which I think is related, one of the questions I had about your research was that you looked at modification notices. People are concerned about the modifications falling foul of the rules around modifications of public contracts. So when you have a safe harbor in your contract that allows for modification, so when you have effectively inbuilt flexibility, which is what you should have for a complex contract, you should not need to publish a modification notice. So that for me, the data set will not reflect the true complexity of those contracts, because most public authorities historically would not publish where they feel very safe that they had the flexibility to renegotiate within their contract. And that's how you would deal with the 5 years, the 10 years, the 15 years, apart from their very strict rules. So that's quite interesting, I think.
Will change that mandated the publication of the contract modification notices? I thought that's what we were specifically about.
So in the UK market, so in the UK, it will only be mandated from next year. In the EU, it's not centrally mandated. It's mandated on a contracting per contracting basis. So some will. So that I thought was really interesting, because actually for me, the contracts with the most discretion and the most flexibility are the ones where you should have the ability and the money and the time to really build in optionality that you need. And that's where you should be able to renegotiate. So for example, defence contracting, there's a defence contracting review in the UK market at the moment. And one of the things everyone knows about defence contracting is there's no point in having a tank that's the second best in the world, right? You've always got to have best in class. And that always means that you've got to be able to update the technologies that comes along. And because you procure over such a long period of time, and it takes you a very, very long time to build an aircraft carrier, you have to be able to change it. So that's where I think it's really interesting. I was really interested to hear what you're saying about the ability to negotiate, because we have to be able to update. Otherwise, what's the point? So those were those two. I think that's enough.
Thank you very much. Yes, let's keep it moving. Very insightful.
Okay.
Jane.
If I respond to the question about the VC, or the observation about, I actually detest abbreviations and acronyms, so it's quite hilarious that I included one myself. But it does raise a really valid point about definitions. And I think so the way that we're interpreting that in social enterprise in Wales at the moment is not for profit. And so I think that, that's the real emphasis there. I think that really does raise a lot of points that, the emphasis at the moment is around how much business we can direct towards SMEs. And I have an issue with that as well, because SMEs it was defined by the European Commission for us in the UK. Actually, the United Kingdom, definitely in Wales, we're a micro and small business economy. We have a missing middle. And so we don't have enough economic stimulus towards the micro and small businesses to be able to win public sector contracts. I've done a lot of work in joint bidding and forming consortia, but it's not an easy process. But hopefully now with the 12-month pipeline, they'll be able to have longer time to develop those kind of relationships. So I've got a lot of issues with a lot of these abbreviations, really. So you gave me the opportunity to be able to raise that one because I think it's a really pertinent issue going forward. But I think so the emphasis being really on SMEs kind of moves people to think about private sector profit-driven organizations. And I think that's why there's much more emphasis on, come on, can we support the charities? Can we help the not-for-profit organizations? And that's very much what this is about in terms of what we're trying to do in Wales at the moment. But thank you very much for the observation and the challenge. I really enjoy that.
Thank you. I would like to just add some empirical observation from literature review regarding social entrepreneurs. There is a very nice paper or evidence from USA which said that social enterprises perform better than for profit in complex contract, and there is also a smaller probability of cancellation of contracts in case of social entrepreneurship. And also I also read a very nice paper in empirical economics, and it's focused on negotiation of contract. Even if we use lowest price criterium, on example of Italy, there is about 30% of cases which were negotiated after. So thank you.
Very much. I wanted to address the first question around how to actually incorporate sort of these smaller organizations and these underrepresented organizations as part of the evaluation process. It is very difficult, and I've spent so much of my career doing it in different ways. I think the first way to look at the first sort of starting point is that when you get to the evaluation stage, it's almost too late to have them in. So you need to be starting much earlier in the process. You're starting with pre-market engagement, and even before that, in sort of pre-existing relationships that the organizations already have with the prison service. Yeah. I mean, I'm from a local authority background, and for us, that the relationships that existed before were grant funded. And so for even to have the conversation from we're going to give you money to be able to do the great work you're already doing to you're now going to be part of commercial contracts was a very difficult conversation, because it was, well, why? We do brilliant work and we've been doing it all this time. So why is it a commercial contract now? And having to start that conversation, that's at pre-market engagement stage, which is we need X amount of services that are being delivered by the organization, but we can't deliver ourselves, and we need the voluntary sector to do it, but as part of a commercial contract with measurable deliverables at the end of it. So it is that pre-market engagement process, and it's probably the hardest conversation you'll have, because that's when all the challenges come through, particularly around tender processes and why it's all so difficult, and why there's so much paperwork, and why there are all these questions and evaluation processes, and why there are all these requirements even after contract's been awarded in terms of measuring benefits. So I'd say you need to sort of start building that in at the very early stages and trying to work out what exactly these organizations that you want to work with can realistically deliver, and seeing if you can create a lotting structure, for example, or separate out contracts that are sort of targeted towards meeting both your need, but also towards supply demand and supply capability in those areas. So I'd start at that very early stage, and then use that to develop and sort of use some of the brilliant market engagement insights that Kate shared earlier, to try and develop a workable contract arrangement that can be fed in through from that pre-market engagement stage into ITT, and then hopefully the evaluation should run itself. No, it won't run itself. But hopefully the evaluation should allow those suppliers to actually demonstrate all those brilliant things that you'd already agreed with them and discussed with them at specification stage and that earlier pre-market engagement stage.
Thank you. Carolyn, you sort of jumped in on somebody else. Would you like to, do you have any concluding comments in response to anything that you've? You did? Okay.
Although I did have something to respond to Jane, what Jane has.
Sure, please.
So I was, I think I was really interested in what you were talking about in terms of social value, right? Because I feel like that's where contracting does get more complex, right? When you try to think about what are the outcomes, and it requires, I think, as you were saying, requires this longer term, approach to contracting. And so I guess since the measure you describe in Wales Wales is very well developed, right? And have you seen this done very effectively in practice yet, where people are actually defining that well and executing on social value? Yeah.
Do you want to transfer the microphone?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. So the report that I mentioned has just been published. We came up with 43 case examples just in a summer project, so I'm sure there are many more. We narrowed it down to 7, but there are some fantastic examples in there. Typically around, I think from conducting the research, which is both desktop, academic literature, but also through interviews as well. What I think people understand value actually, but they don't understand social. And I think that's the problem. And I think there's still a lot of work to be done there. Going back to the point about social enterprise, I actually met somebody a couple of months ago who's actually working on a PhD thesis on what do we mean by social enterprise. So I think that's where we are. I think the great thing is we're asking these questions. I think it's really, defining social value. I think if I came out with something, I think came out with over 40 definitions of social value. But if you look at definitions of supply chain management, back in 2011, one of the authors identified 287 definitions. So we've still got a long way to go. But I think we've got to make it work for the community in which we're serving. I think the fact that we're asking these deep questions now is a really important turning point to becoming revolutionary. And I think that, I would say that that's the urgency that we've got now, is particularly in the UK, is to make this legislation work for us in a much better way. And I know in Wales, the United Nations quote that when they heard about the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, what Wales is doing today, the world will do tomorrow. It's not been easy. It's challenging. It's really challenging. But there are some great examples, illustrations of moving from overseas sourcing to partnering with local suppliers where the product didn't exist before, actually saying, well, look, this is what I'm buying overseas. Since I think the pandemic was an accelerator of change, particularly making us think when borders came to a close. We have to become more resilient now, and I think it's kind of forced this change in behaviour and having to think differently about procurement. Do we need to procure it at all? So I think there's a lot going on at the moment, but having the Act has definitely been really fundamental turning point. But yeah, very interesting to watch the progression. But there's a lot I'm very happy to share anything online with you following this session. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Well, we're wrapping up now. I'm good. Well, thank you. I want to thank you all very much. Thanks to the panelists. Thanks to everybody who contributed a question or a comment. Thank you very much for the ongoing discussion here. There is a movement towards professionalizing public procurement, and I think we're all part of that movement. There is a peer learning group that the GoLab co-supports with the Faculty of Law. The peer learning group is called the Oxford Pogo Club. It's even more fun than it sounds. The Procurement of Government Outcomes Club, everybody's very welcome. We'll continue this conversation. We very often have online conversations on a monthly basis, the last Tuesday of the month. So please do participate. If you want to come and be on the panel, let me know. Up next, I think we've got the big picture session at 4 p.m. after some coffee. So let's continue the conversation over coffee. Thank you.